On a seemingly ordinary morning, a powerful black woman stepped onto a plane, confident and ready for her next big business deal. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company known for pushing boundaries and making waves in the industry. Her company had risen from the ground up, and she was now a role model for many young, aspiring entrepreneurs. She had worked hard for every step of success, and today, she was about to take another step forward, boarding a flight to a crucial meeting that could change the future of her business. She was traveling with her executive assistant, and they were both in good spirits. The flight was a routine one, taking her from her headquarters to a city on the other side of the country where she had important talks with potential investors. This flight was supposed to be the calm before the storm, a brief break from the chaos of her business schedule. As she settled into her first-class seat, she glanced around the cabin, noting the mix of passengers who were also heading to various destinations. The air was comfortable, the plane had just started to taxi, and everything seemed perfect for a smooth journey. She smiled at her assistant, who was seated beside her, and they exchanged a few words about their upcoming agenda. It was a typical pre-meeting conversation, focused and optimistic. But what happened next would shatter that calm. Just as the plane was beginning to make its way down the runway, two uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. They seemed to move with purpose, eyes scanning the room, before they locked their gaze on the CEO. The officers approached, and without any warning, one of them asked her to stand up. The voice was polite, but there was a noticeable edge to it. The CEO was immediately confused. She had done nothing wrong. She had a valid ticket, her identification was in order, and she was on a routine flight to an important meeting. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said. "We need you to come with us." The CEO was taken aback. She looked at the assistant, who was equally puzzled. "Is everything okay?" she asked, not sure if this was some sort of mistake. The officer didn't answer directly. He simply repeated his request, "We need you to come with us." He motioned toward the aisle, signaling that she was required to leave the plane. At first, she thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was some mistake with her boarding pass or a glitch in the system. She had dealt with small travel mishaps before, but this felt different. The officer's tone was firm, almost insistent. When she didn't immediately rise from her seat, he placed a hand on her arm, urging her to comply. "Ma'am, please, we don't want to escalate this," the officer said, his words carrying a strange coldness that made her stomach turn. This wasn't just a routine request. The CEO's mind raced. She had never been in a situation like this. She was a leader, an accomplished, powerful woman who had never been treated like this before. Why were they pulling her off the plane? She had already checked in, confirmed her flight, and had no reason to be singled out. "Is this about my ticket?" "I have it right here," she said, standing up and reaching into her bag to grab the boarding pass. The officer didn't respond to her question. He simply stepped aside, indicating she should follow him. At this point, the CEO stood up, confused and upset, and followed the officer down the aisle. She tried to maintain her composure, but the situation felt wrong. People were watching. Some passengers exchanged puzzled glances, others whispered to one another, and a few even took out their phones to capture the scene unfolding before them. As she walked toward the plane's exit, she couldn't help but feel a sense of humiliation creeping in. The plane had just started its journey, and she was now being escorted off as if she were some kind of criminal. The entire experience felt surreal, as though the world had turned upside down in an instant. Once she reached the door of the plane, the officer paused. He was clearly waiting for something, but she wasn't sure what. He simply stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking again. "You'll need to step outside, ma'am," he said. Her mind was racing. Why was this happening? She looked back one last time at her assistant, who was still seated, looking confused and worried. She tried to read the faces of the passengers who were watching, but no one said a word. It felt as though the world had gone silent. The CEO stood frozen for a second, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't understand why this was happening. She had been in the business world for years, managing deals worth billions of dollars, but nothing had prepared her for this. It was a feeling of injustice, of something so deeply wrong that it made her question everything she had ever known about fairness and equality. With a deep breath, she followed the officer off the plane. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, leaving the flight and the world of passengers behind her. As she stepped onto the tarmac, a part of her wanted to lash out, to scream at the officers, but she knew that would only make matters worse. Instead, she focused on regaining her composure. She would not let this define her. Not today. Not in front of these people. She would find out what had gone wrong, and she would get to the bottom of this. She wouldn't let herself be humiliated in silence. The feeling of injustice lingered as she stood on the tarmac, looking back at the plane she had just been removed from. But deep inside her, a fire began to grow. This was not over. Not by a long shot. And the airline would soon learn just how wrong they had been to treat her this way. The world would know that she was not someone to be pushed around. The fight for fairness, for respect, for what was right, had only just begun. And as she walked away from the plane, her mind already raced with thoughts of how she would make the airline answer for their actions. She had no idea yet how big the consequences would be, but she knew one thing for sure: this incident wouldn't go unnoticed. After the plane incident, the CEO was left standing on the tarmac, feeling a mix of shock and disbelief. As she watched the plane pull away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the humiliation of being escorted off the plane like she had done something wrong, it was the way it had all unfolded. The officer had been insistent, even forceful. It was as if she was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. She knew she had to stay calm, but inside, she was seething with anger. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding with her ticket or some technical error. There was something deeper at play, and she could feel it. She had been traveling for years, and never, not once, had she been treated like this. It was clear that it was not about her boarding pass, it was something else entirely. Her assistant, who had been sitting beside her, looked just as shocked as she was. The assistant stepped out of the terminal with her, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What just happened?" she asked, still trying to make sense of it all. "I don't know," the CEO said, her voice tight. "But this isn't over." She was determined. It wasn't just a personal embarrassment. This was an opportunity to make a statement. She wasn't going to let an unjust action slide without standing up for herself and for the countless others who had likely experienced something similar. As she stepped into a private car that had been waiting for her at the gate, she pulled out her phone, dialing her legal team. There was no way she was going to let this go without taking action. The CEO's legal team was well versed in high-profile cases, and she had always relied on them to handle situations with care and precision. But this time, it felt different. She wasn't just preparing for a typical corporate dispute. This was personal. Within minutes, her team was on a conference call with her, the tone already serious. "We're already looking into it," one of her senior lawyers said. "I pulled up the footage from the gate. We'll figure out what happened, but you have every right to be upset." "I want to know exactly what happened," she said. "Not just with my ticket, but with the entire situation. Why was I treated that way? We need to get to the bottom of it." Her legal team was already in action. They promised to have a full investigation started immediately, pulling in every piece of information they could from the flight logs to the security footage. They also planned to issue a formal request for a public statement from the airline's top executives. The CEO knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared for the fight. She wasn't going to back down. While the wheels of her legal team were turning, the CEO knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for answers. She needed to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been discriminated against in similar ways. It wasn't just a matter of being treated poorly, it was a matter of justice. This needed to be bigger than a single incident. Within hours, the news of the CEO's removal from the plane began to spread. Social media exploded with outrage. People from all walks of life were talking about it. Some were angered by the treatment of a powerful woman who had earned everything she had, while others saw it as a glaring example of systemic discrimination. Stories of similar experiences began flooding social media, with individuals recounting their own moments of being unfairly treated based on their race or background. The incident had sparked a conversation that went far beyond a simple flight delay. News outlets picked up the story quickly, and within a day, the headlines were everywhere: CEO pulled off plane racial profiling or just a mistake. The CEO's company received messages of support from around the world. People were calling for answers, demanding an explanation from the airline, and backing her decision to speak out. Her legal team was already in contact with major media outlets, making sure they presented her story in the best possible light. The CEO knew that this was her chance to turn a negative experience into something that could lead to real change. She wasn't just upset for herself, she was angry for all the people who had been treated unfairly in the past and didn't have the power or platform to do something about it. She knew she could be the voice for those who felt voiceless. Back at her office, her staff worked tirelessly to monitor the situation. The support she received was overwhelming. Her employees rallied behind her, and many of her corporate partners reached out to offer their solidarity. Her company's social media accounts were flooded with messages of support, and the hashtag #StandWithCEO trended for days. She couldn't help but feel proud. It wasn't just about her, it was about creating a shift in how companies treated their customers, especially those who had been marginalized. Meanwhile, the airline remained relatively silent. They released a statement acknowledging the incident, but it felt weak and half-hearted. "We deeply regret any inconvenience this caused our passenger," the airline's statement read. "We are investigating the matter fully and will take appropriate action." The CEO wasn't satisfied with that response. She knew that an apology was not enough. This wasn't about simply saying sorry, it was about real accountability. She needed more. She needed change. And she knew the best way to achieve that was through her next move. The next day, she called an emergency meeting with her board of directors. She had made her decision. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined. "We're pulling the $4 billion deal," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We've been in negotiations for months now, but I can't, in good conscience, continue doing business with a company that supports this kind of behavior." Her board members were shocked. The deal was significant, an investment that could propel the airline into a new era of growth. But the CEO wasn't backing down. She had made her choice, and she was going to stand by it. It wasn't just about the money, it was about setting an example. This was her way of telling the world that discrimination, in any form, would not be tolerated. By the time the decision was publicly announced, the media was already buzzing. The CEO's company had officially withdrawn its investment. Headlines shifted again this time. The story wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about what the CEO had done afterward. The focus turned to the boldness of her actions and the message it sent. She wasn't just a CEO of a successful company, she was a leader, a trailblazer, and now, a symbol of justice. The story was far from over. The CEO had made her mark, and she knew the road ahead would be tough. But she was ready for it. She had a fight on her hands, but she had the power, the resources, and the determination to win. And she wasn't going to stop until the airline and the world understood that she would never tolerate injustice, no matter the cost. The days following the CEO's decision to pull the $4 billion investment deal were filled with intense media coverage and public discussions. Her bold move had turned the story from a personal incident on a plane into a powerful statement about racial inequality and corporate responsibility. The world was watching, and the airline was under pressure to respond in a way that would satisfy the public's growing demand for justice. News outlets all over the world covered the incident, and the CEO's actions became a symbol of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Many applauded her for using her platform and power to send a message. Her phone didn't stop ringing, with messages of support pouring in from fellow CEOs, civil rights activists, and even everyday people who felt empowered by her decision. They admired her strength and the courage it took to stand up against an institution that had, for too long, been allowed to get away with discriminatory practices. The public outcry against the airline was growing louder with every passing day. Stock prices, which had been steadily rising before the incident, started to take a hit. The CEO's withdrawal of the investment had sent a clear message: she would not tolerate any form of injustice, and neither should anyone else. People began to question the airline's commitment to diversity and equality. Was this a one-off mistake, or was there a deeper, systemic issue within the company? The silence from the airline's leadership only added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, the CEO was working tirelessly behind the scenes. While she had made her decision public, she wasn't just sitting back and letting things unfold. She was determined to turn this situation into a force for good. She reached out to influential leaders in various industries, calling for a collective effort to push for real change in how businesses treat their customers, especially those from marginalized communities. The CEO knew that to make a lasting impact, she needed to rally people behind her cause, and that meant more than just speaking out, it meant action. Her efforts were not in vain. Soon, a coalition of companies, organizations, and activists had formed, all united under the cause of creating more inclusive corporate environments. It wasn't just about the airline anymore, it was about changing the culture of business as a whole. The CEO's decision had sparked a movement that went beyond her own experience. It was clear that systemic racism in corporate America was still a huge issue, and now, people were beginning to stand up and demand accountability. As the coalition grew, the CEO took part in several high-profile interviews and discussions. She spoke passionately about the need for companies to do more than just pay lip service to diversity and inclusion. She talked about her own experiences, how she had worked tirelessly to build her company, how she had fought for every opportunity, and how, despite all her success, she had been subjected to unfair treatment simply because of her race. Her words resonated with many, and soon, more companies began to sign on to the movement. But the CEO wasn't done yet. She knew that just talking about change wasn't enough. She needed to hold the airline accountable in a way that would make a real difference. With her legal team already working on the details, she began to draft a set of demands for the airline's leadership. It wasn't just about the security officer or the incident on the plane, it was about holding the entire organization responsible for its role in perpetuating a culture of discrimination. Her demands were clear and non-negotiable. First, the CEO insisted that the airline immediately implement a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program across all levels of the company, from the top executives to the front-line staff. This program would include mandatory training on unconscious bias, anti-racism, and how to handle difficult situations involving passengers. Second, she called for an independent investigation into the airline's policies and practices, with a particular focus on how they were handling complaints of discrimination. Third, she demanded a public apology not just from the airline CEO, but from every leader within the company who had allowed this culture to fester. The airline's board of directors was now in a difficult position. The CEO's demands were hard to ignore, and the pressure from the public and her coalition of supporters was only mounting. The board held a special meeting to discuss how to respond, but it was clear that they were struggling to come up with a solution that would appease both the public and their investors. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, the damage to their reputation would only deepen. But they also knew that making the changes the CEO was asking for would require a major overhaul of their corporate culture, and that wouldn't happen overnight. Behind closed doors, the airline CEO was scrambling to salvage the situation. He reached out to the CEO of the tech company, hoping to smooth things over and find a way to restore their relationship. But the CEO wasn't interested in just words. She wanted to see real, tangible changes. The talks between the two CEOs were tense. The airline CEO promised to take immediate action, but the CEO of the tech company wasn't convinced. She had seen this kind of corporate speak before, empty promises meant to save face. This time, she was holding the airline to a higher standard. Despite the airline's attempts to make amends, the CEO of the tech company remained resolute. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. She had become a symbol of change, and she wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The media continued to cover the unfolding drama, and public support for the CEO's position only grew stronger. People from all walks of life were sharing their own stories of discrimination, showing that the problem was far more widespread than anyone had initially thought. The conversation about race and power in corporate America was no longer something that could be ignored. The CEO's actions had started a ripple effect, and she knew that change was on the horizon. But as the pressure on the airline mounted, she also knew that her next move would be crucial. She wasn't about to let the airline off the hook without making sure they fully understood the consequences of their actions. She wasn't just fighting for a settlement or an apology, she was fighting for a complete transformation of how companies treated their customers, especially those from underrepresented communities. The stakes were high, but the CEO felt more determined than ever. This was her moment to make history. And she wasn't about to let it slip away. The tension surrounding the CEO's decision to pull $4 billion from the airline continued to escalate as the world waited for the company's next move. The CEO, now the face of a growing movement for equality and corporate accountability, had created a ripple effect that no one could ignore. The airline, meanwhile, was grappling with the consequences of its actions, not just in terms of its reputation, but also financially. Stock prices continued to dip, and customers, especially those loyal to the CEO's tech company, began to look elsewhere for their flights. The CEO's demands had shaken the airline to its core. The public apology that they had issued barely scratched the surface. The CEO knew this wasn't enough. Words without action were hollow, and she wasn't interested in the company offering empty promises. It was clear that the airline's leadership hadn't grasped the magnitude of the issue. Her move to pull the investment had not only created headlines, but also forced the airline to confront a serious problem it had long ignored. Behind closed doors, the airline's board of directors was under immense pressure. Their once confident tone had turned to uncertainty. They knew they had to act quickly, but what could they do? A diversity program wouldn't erase years of poorly handled incidents. An apology wouldn't undo the harm done to the CEO or the countless others who had been treated unfairly by the airline. The leadership of the airline, once immune to such public scrutiny, now found themselves scrambling to salvage their credibility. In an emergency meeting, the airline CEO sat with his board of directors, attempting to come up with a solution. The message from the public was clear: they needed to demonstrate that they were serious about making things right. But what did that even look like? The damage was significant, and the timeline for regaining public trust felt daunting. As the meeting continued, the airline CEO suggested a series of immediate actions, starting with the termination of the security officer who had been directly involved in the incident. The officer would be investigated, but the CEO was already making it clear that the person would be removed from their position. The idea was to send a strong message to the public that they wouldn't tolerate discrimination of any kind. However, the CEO of the airline knew that this was just one piece of the puzzle, and it was far from enough. Meanwhile, the CEO of the tech company, still deeply upset but resolute in her stance, was meeting with her legal team again, strategizing for the next phase. Her legal team had spent the last few days gathering evidence and building a case against the airline. They weren't just going after the airline for the incident, they were going to push for systemic change, for accountability, and for the airline to prove that it would prioritize diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way. The CEO had made her demands clear, and her legal team was working around the clock to ensure that the airline could not just sweep this under the rug. They were also preparing a public letter, which would be released to the media to ensure that her position remained transparent and unwavering. It was a carefully crafted letter, one that would lay out not just the demands of her company, but the collective demands of a broader coalition that had come together in support of her cause. While her legal team worked on the details, the CEO herself began to reach out to other influential leaders, business leaders, activists, and even government officials who might lend their voices to the growing movement. She knew that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about sending a message to the world that corporate America had to do better. Companies could no longer operate in a vacuum, and they could no longer treat marginalized groups as an afterthought. The CEO had made an impact, but she knew the battle was far from over. The momentum that had built around her decision to pull the funding wasn't just going to fizzle out. It was now a conversation that was bigger than her. It was about corporate responsibility, racial justice, and the kind of world that people wanted to create for the future. She was determined to make sure that her company's actions would be a model for others to follow, one that showed that standing up for what was right was not just a moral choice but a business one as well. As the pressure mounted on the airline to respond, the public continued to demand answers. But it wasn't just the public that was pushing the airline. The CEO's actions had spurred a wave of introspection in the corporate world, and many companies were now re-evaluating their own practices. Executives across the country were taking a closer look at their diversity programs, realizing that they, too, could be held accountable if they didn't step up. By the end of the week, the airline CEO made a public announcement. The company, he claimed, had heard the message loud and clear. He expressed regret for the incident and the harm it had caused to the CEO, acknowledging that they had failed to live up to the standards of fairness and respect that they claimed to uphold. But for many, his words still didn't feel enough. A simple apology could not erase the damage caused. The CEO of the tech company, however, wasn't swayed by the apology. She had heard all the right words before. She wasn't interested in what the airline said. She wanted to see what they were going to do about it. What real, tangible steps were they taking to address the underlying issues? The CEO knew that this was not just about the incident with her, it was about ensuring that other people wouldn't face the same treatment in the future. After the airline's announcement, the CEO of the tech company released her own statement. She was direct, as she always was. An apology is a start, but it is not enough, she said. The airline needs to show the world that it is committed to real change. The people who work for this company need to feel safe, respected, and valued, no matter their race, gender, or background. Until then, my company will not be re-engaging with this airline. I am committed to holding them accountable, and I will continue to advocate for the changes that are so desperately needed in corporate America. The statement made headlines once again, and the CEO's commitment to seeing this through resonated with people all over the world. This wasn't just a battle over one incident, it was a battle for fairness, for respect, and for a future where no one would ever have to experience the kind of discrimination that she had. It was a battle that she was determined to win. As the days passed, the airline began to feel the weight of the public's scrutiny. The pressure from both inside and outside the company was mounting, and the leadership knew they needed to act. But the CEO of the tech company wasn't going to back down. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. She had already made history with her decision to pull the funding, but she knew that the real, lasting change was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the aftermath of the CEO's bold decision continued to unfold. The news of her actions had spread across the world, inspiring a ripple effect that couldn't be ignored. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, and the pressure on the airline to make meaningful changes grew by the day. Meanwhile, the CEO was still at the center of it all, navigating a delicate but crucial phase in her mission for justice and corporate accountability. The CEO had spent much of her time in meetings with her legal team, strategizing her next moves and staying focused on the bigger picture. Her vision for change was not just about one airline, it was about setting a precedent for corporate America. She knew that if she could force the airline to overhaul its policies, it would send a clear message to other companies that they could no longer get away with discriminatory practices. Her legal team had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence, and preparing for the next phase. The investigation into the airline's policies was already underway, and soon, a series of reports would come to light, shedding light on the airline's troubling history of mistreatment toward customers, particularly people of color. The public was hungry for answers, and the CEO was determined to give them the truth. She knew this transparency would put pressure on the airline to follow through on its promises. But while the investigation continued, the CEO was not content to wait in the background. She was fully aware of the power she held not just as a successful businesswoman, but as a symbol for change. Her actions had already made waves in the corporate world, and now, she began to focus on building a coalition of other business leaders, activists, and organizations that could help support her cause. She knew that to create lasting change, she needed allies who were just as passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion as she was. In her talks with other influential leaders, the CEO shared her vision for a future where businesses prioritized justice and fairness over profit. She spoke candidly about the struggles she had faced as a Black woman in the business world and how those struggles had only made her more determined to fight for others. The response was overwhelming. CEOs from a wide range of industries reached out, offering their support and pledging to take similar actions to address racial inequality within their own organizations. The CEO was beginning to build a network of like-minded individuals who were ready to challenge the status quo. Her message began to resonate beyond the business community. Employees from various companies began speaking out, sharing their stories of discrimination and the need for change in corporate culture. The conversation shifted from an isolated incident on a plane to a nationwide movement calling for justice. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of support, with the hashtag corporate change trending for days. It was clear that this wasn't just about the airline anymore, it was about transforming the very fabric of corporate America. Meanwhile, the airline was feeling the heat. The board of directors had taken initial steps to address the issue, but it was clear that their efforts were not enough. They had removed the security officer involved in the incident, but that was just a small step. The public wanted to see real, systemic changes. The airline CEO had attempted to salvage the company's reputation with a public apology, but it had fallen flat. Words were no longer enough. The airline needed to prove that it was committed to making things right. Behind closed doors, the airline's leadership was in turmoil. They had no choice but to acknowledge that their response thus far had been inadequate. The CEO of the airline called for an emergency meeting with his board of directors, hoping to find a solution that would placate the public and repair the company's image. But the situation was far more complicated than they had initially thought. The CEO of the tech company had set a standard that they now had to meet, one that demanded not just superficial changes, but a deep, institutional shift in the way they operated. The airline CEO realized that they could no longer afford to brush the issue aside. In a final attempt to salvage the situation, the airline announced a series of sweeping changes aimed at addressing the root causes of discrimination within the company. They promised to implement a comprehensive diversity training program for all employees, with a particular focus on unconscious bias and how to prevent discrimination. The airline also vowed to hire an independent firm to conduct an audit of their policies and procedures to ensure that they were in line with industry best practices for diversity and inclusion. But even as the airline made these promises, the CEO of the tech company wasn't convinced. She had heard all the right words before, empty commitments meant to smooth over the situation without addressing the deeper, more systemic issues. She wasn't going to let the airline off the hook so easily. She had seen firsthand how quickly companies could make empty promises without following through on their obligations. The CEO's resolve remained firm. She knew that her decision to pull $4 billion in funding had sent shockwaves through the business world, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about ensuring that her actions led to real, lasting change. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than a complete transformation in how businesses treated their customers, especially those who had been marginalized for far too long. As the days passed, the CEO's influence continued to grow. More companies reached out, offering their support and pledging to take action. The movement she had sparked was now a powerful force for change, and it was clear that the impact would be felt for years to come. The airline, once a symbol of corporate power, was now forced to confront the reality of its mistakes and take steps to make things right. Finally, the CEO of the tech company received the response she had been waiting for, a formal, public apology from the airline, along with a commitment to implement the changes she had demanded. The airline CEO personally called her to express regret for the incident and to assure her that the company was taking the necessary steps to address the issues within their organization. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And the CEO, though still cautious, was willing to give them a chance to prove their commitment to change. The CEO had won. Her actions had set a precedent, not just for the airline, but for corporate America as a whole. She had shown the world that standing up for what was right could lead to tangible, lasting change. She had proven that one person, armed with conviction and determination, could change the course of an entire industry. As she sat in her office, looking out over the city, the CEO reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It had been a difficult and painful road, but she had never wavered in her commitment to justice. She had fought for herself, for her company, and for the countless others who had been treated unfairly. And in the end, she had succeeded not just in making the airline accountable, but in igniting a movement that would continue to shape the future of business. Her work wasn't finished yet. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that the world was beginning to listen. And that, in itself, was a victory.